Hi, thanks for listening to my talk. My name is Alexandra Urza. I'm a research ecologist at the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. Today I'll be presenting a talk entitled Episodic Establishment Drives Post-Fire Big Sagebrush Recovery. And I'll be talking about adaptive management strategies to promote resilience in the context of interannual climatic variability. I wanted to first acknowledge my co-authors, Peter Weisberg, Dave Board, Jean Chambers, Stan Kitchen, and Bruce Roundy. So in the Western US, sagebrush-dominated shrublands are one of the most extensive vegetation types, and they form a critical habitat for a wide range of wildlife species. But in recent decades, there's been widespread loss of sagebrush habitats, largely as a result of increasing fire. So of course, fire is a natural disturbance in this ecosystem, but it also has the potential to facilitate the invasion of fire-adapted exotic species, such as cheatgrass or Bromus tectorum. Cheatgrass is highly flammable and it's able to quickly colonize burn sites. So invasion can initiate a grass fire cycle that can lead to increasing fire size and frequency and eventually can lead to the loss of the native ecosystem if it's unable to recover after these disturbances. In dryland environments, ecosystem dynamics are strongly influenced by temporal variability in water resources. And we know that both fire and invasion dynamics are strongly influenced by temporal variability in annual weather, but we know a lot less about the effects of climate variability on the post-fire recovery of dominant native species, such as sagebrush. Big sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata, is a perennial shrub that's the dominant species across much of the Western US. But big sagebrush is relatively poorly adapted to fire, so it's not capable of resprouting, so post-fire recovery must occur through seeds. It has relatively short distance seed dispersal, and it has a weak seed bank, so seeds are viable for only 1 to 2 years. And this all means that there's often limited seed availability after large, high-severity fires, like this 2015 soda fire. So in the hopes of increasing post-fire sagebrush recovery, the major US land management agencies, including the Forest Service and the BLM, have been investing heavily in post-fire sagebrush seeding, but the results have been pretty mixed. There are multiple studies that have observed minimal sagebrush recovery in both seeded and unseeded sites. So clearly just providing seeds doesn't necessarily result in improved restoration outcomes. And this suggests that environmental conditions may also be limiting establishment. So the specific questions of our study: first, how does post-fire sagebrush establishment respond to interannual climate variability and time since fire? So do year-to-year fluctuations affect establishment, or do sites have relatively consistent recovery through time? And how does this play out as time since fire increases? And then the second question is, how do temporal patterns of sagebrush establishment affect population recovery? So does it even matter how frequently establishment occurs, or just how big some establishment events are? Our project leveraged a long-term regional experimental network, the Sagebrush Step Treatment Evaluation Project. This project was set up to test the effects of common fuels management treatments across the Intermountain West. We sampled in 33 plots in 12 sites from both the Sage Step Network and also Underdown Canyon in central Nevada. These sites were burned under prescription between 2002 and 2008. In each of our plots, we measured vegetation cover and density by species, and we measured and collected stem samples from all sagebrush individuals within variable radius plots at each site. So those stem samples, you can see a picture of them on the upper left there, were used to determine establishment dates for each sagebrush using annual ring counts. The output data, there's an example of output data in this histogram in the upper right. The y-axis here is just the count of the number of sagebrush individuals that established in each of those calendar years at this one particular site. And this is one example, but it is fairly representative of all of our site data. You can see that post-fire establishment patterns were highly episodic. So we have these big establishment years kind of interspersed with much smaller establishment years or years with no establishment. Another kind of important thing to point out is that all of our sites had some pre-fire sagebrush establishment from our establishment data. So this means that there were residual sagebrush individuals that were presumably providing seeds to the site through time. We also measured hourly soil temperature and water matrix potential at each of our sites. And we took those hourly measurements and aggregated them into seasonal variables for each year at each site. So to address our first question, we modeled annual establishment density as a function of seasonal soil environmental variables, those seasonal variables that I just talked about, and time since fire. And here we used boosted regression trees to handle the nonlinear relationships that we saw in the data. This figure that's shown here is a marginal effects plot from the boosted regression tree output. So the y-axis is annual establishment density. In this case, the x-axis are spring wet days. So these are the number of days in the spring season where soil matrix potential was above wilting point, so where there was available water for plants. And then that gray dashed line is the median establishment across our sites. So the first thing we were interested in is how does post-fire establishment respond to annual climate conditions? And we found that the most important predictor variables across the board were variables related to conditions during the spring season and during the year of establishment. The most important variable, most important predictor was spring wet days. That's in this figure here. And establishment was favored by wet and cool springs in that year of establishment. The second thing that we were interested in is how long after fire does establishment occur. This is the same marginal effects plot, except in this case, the x-axis is time since fire shown in years. And you can see that there's a huge drop off after about 4 to 5 years after fire, where establishment density becomes much lower after that, even given favorable climate conditions. So this suggests that we have this ephemeral window of opportunity for post-fire establishment. We tested many other predictor variables. We found a very weak effect of summer environmental conditions. And we also didn't see an effect of lagged year conditions. So we didn't see the effect of environmental conditions in the years following establishment. So this suggests that that first year seedling survival is the most limiting. So for our second question, we modeled sagebrush cover and density, so at the time of our field sampling, as a function of the magnitude and frequency of establishment using linear mixed effects models. To remind you, the question we were asking was, how do temporal patterns of sagebrush establishment affect population recovery? And here we found that population recovery was strongly related to the magnitude of the largest post-fire establishment pulse, but less sensitive to the frequency of establishment. So this figure here shows total big sagebrush density at the time of our field sampling on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the maximum annual establishment. So this is the size of that largest post-fire establishment year for that particular site. And you can see that there's a strongly linear relationship. That maximum annual establishment year was also highly predictive of big sagebrush cover, but that relationship was a little bit weaker. All right, so just to sum up the results, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about management implications. So first, we found that post-fire recruitment was driven by the episodic availability of spring soil moisture. So again, establishment was favored by those wet and cool spring conditions. In an analysis that I didn't have time to show here, we also found that establishment patterns were really poorly predicted by mean climate conditions. So it really was, establishment was really reacting or responding to the interannual variation in climate conditions. Our results would suggest that increasing temperatures would reduce the probability of favorable weather conditions on average, but these low frequency establishment pulses may buffer the effects of average warming climate. We also found that long-term population recovery reflected the magnitude, but not the frequency of establishment pulses. So maximum annual establishment was the strongest predictor of both density and cover 10 to 15 years after fire when we sampled. And this suggested a single successful establishment year could result in rapid population recovery, even in those warm and dry sites. All right, so our results provide support for an adaptive management strategy that could improve restoration outcomes by maximizing the probability that seed availability coincides with favorable weather conditions. So first, we found that given favorable environmental conditions, there was a high probability of sagebrush establishment for several years after fire. So we found that that window was about 4 to 5 years after fire. And that window greatly exceeds that 1 to 2 year period of seed viability when seeds are viable in the soil seed bank. And this suggests a critical role of fire refugia or unburned patches for providing an in situ seed source to recolonize sites after fire. Of course, we can't always control the distribution of our unburned patches across the landscape, especially after wildfire. So these results also suggest that the opportunity for restoration treatments may be longer than we previously thought. So typically, post-fire restoration treatments occur in the first 1 and sometimes 2 years after fire. But we found that during that 4 to 5 year post-fire window, there may be a higher probability of sagebrush establishment than we would have previously thought. So this provides a couple of different, or provides support for a couple of different strategies. So first, seasonal weather forecasts can be used to better time seeding treatments with more optimal weather conditions. And then second, repeated seeding can be used in high priority areas. So this is when seeding treatments are done in subsequent years in higher priority areas to increase the probability that a seeding treatment happens during a year with favorable weather conditions. Besides improving the ecological outcome, planned repeated seeding treatments could also decrease some of the market uncertainties related to native seeds. So that's all that I have. Thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thank you.